talking about? Why didn't you show me this yesterday?
Well, she got pregnant at a young age.
There's something uniquely horrible about a bad interview. Movies can be edited, books can be rewritten, but a live TV interview is a time capsule of a specific moment when a person was either saying something they didn't mean to say, or was being pushed into saying it, or was revealing something they had no idea they were revealing. And once it's out there forever, and nothing anybody does afterward can put it back. What you're about to hear are 6 TV interviews that, for various reasons, have become deeply, permanently disturbing in retrospect. Some of them were disturbing the moment they aired. Some of them only became disturbing after we found out what happened next. Let's begin. For roughly 19 years, Ellen DeGeneres had one of the most beloved and successful daytime talk shows in American television history. She was the Be Kind lady. She danced at the top of every episode. She made audiences laugh. She gave away cars. She was, by every public metric, the nicest person in Hollywood.
In the future, you're going to see these 60 and 70-year-old people at the weddings going...
The kind of celebrity whose entire brand was built on the idea that she would never, ever be cruel to another human being, because cruelty was the one thing she had publicly made her life's work to reject. Then, in 2020, a series of reports from BuzzFeed News citing current and former employees blew the entire thing apart. The allegations were brutal. A toxic workplace culture, sexual misconduct from senior producers, racist incidents, intimidation, fear, and a behind-the-scenes atmosphere that bore absolutely no resemblance to the smiling, hugging, be kind persona that Ellen had been selling to America for nearly 2 decades. Warner Brothers launched an internal investigation. 3 top producers were fired. The show limped along for 2 more seasons and was cancelled in 2022. And here's the thing. Once the allegations broke, people started going back through old episodes of the show looking at moments they'd previously dismissed as quirky or funny, and they started noticing patterns.
Hilarious.
She's my favorite comedian. Other than you.
There were interviews where Ellen pushed guests way past the point of comfort. There were moments where she made jokes at their expense that only registered as jokes if you assumed she was friendly, and the second you removed that assumption, they just looked like jokes at someone's expense. And one interview in particular, an interview from 2008, came rushing back into the public consciousness with a kind of sick clarity that nobody was prepared for, because once you knew what had actually been happening in Mariah Carey's life on the day she sat down across from Ellen DeGeneres, the entire clip became something you could not watch without wanting to turn off the internet and go for a long walk. The situation began in 2008, when Mariah Carey went on the show to promote something, which is what celebrities do on talk shows. They promote things. That's the entire economic model of daytime television. At the time, there were tabloid rumors circulating that Carey was pregnant with her then-husband Nick Cannon.
The singer, who married then-husband Nick Cannon about 6 months prior to her sit-down with Ellen, did everything she could to dodge the TV personality's persistence.
She had not confirmed these rumors. She had not denied them. She had, like most private people dealing with private matters, decided that her pregnancy was nobody's business until she was ready to say it was her business, which is a completely reasonable position that pregnant women have been taking since the invention of pregnancy. Ellen had other plans. About 30 seconds into the interview, Ellen brought up the rumors. Mariah tried to deflect. She said politely that she didn't want to discuss it.
People are saying that that you're pregnant. There's rumors.
Don't discuss that.
All right. Well,
Any normal interviewer, any normal human being with basic social instincts would have taken the hint and moved on. Ellen did not move on. Ellen doubled down. She produced from off-camera 2 glasses of champagne and announced to Mariah that they should toast to you not being pregnant if you're not pregnant, which is on paper an incredibly aggressive way to force a woman to reveal her pregnancy status on national television, because the only way out of the trap is to either drink the champagne, confirming you're not pregnant, or refuse to drink the champagne, confirming you are. Mariah's face in this clip is something you cannot unsee once you've seen it. She says, "I can't believe you did this to me, Ellen."
you want to taste it?
I can't believe you did this to me, Ellen.
She says, "This is peer pressure." She tries to laugh it off.
No,
This
I'm
is
just
peer
gonna
pressure.
say.
Do you see what Ellen is doing? This is peer pressure.
She says it's too early for her to drink, trying to find any possible exit from the corner she's been backed into.
It's too early for me. I only drink it after 3 p.m.
Ellen keeps pushing. Mariah eventually raises the glass to her lips and pretends, very obviously pretends, to take a sip. At which point Ellen triumphantly shouts, "You're pregnant!" The audience laughs.
You're pregnant. You're pregnant.
Mariah laughs too, because what else are you supposed to do when you're sitting in front of a live audience and millions of viewers and a host who has just steamrolled over your personal autonomy for the sake of a bit? And here's where the clip goes from uncomfortable to genuinely, permanently horrible. Mariah Carey was pregnant during that interview. She had been pregnant. She'd been keeping it quiet because she had previously suffered a miscarriage and she wasn't ready to tell anyone. And shortly after that interview aired, she miscarried again.
Carey ended up suffering another miscarriage shortly after her 2008 Ellen interview.
The pregnancy that Ellen had forced her to perform for the cameras, the pregnancy she was trying to protect by simply not talking about it, ended. Mariah would later speak about this in a 2020 Vulture interview, 12 years after the fact, when the Ellen allegations were dominating headlines and old clips were resurfacing everywhere, and she said, very carefully, very measured, that she was extremely uncomfortable with that moment and had a hard time grappling with the aftermath. She added, and this is the part that sits with you, that there is an empathy that can be applied to those moments that I would have liked to have been implemented. But what am I supposed to do? What am I supposed to do? That's the question, isn't it? What are you supposed to do when you're a guest on a show, and the host, in front of a live audience and cameras, and millions of viewers, decides that your private medical situation is comedy material, and the only way out is to either lie or humiliate yourself, and then hours or days later, you lose the pregnancy you were trying to protect, and the clip is now forever, and people laugh when they watch it because they think it's just a fun Ellen moment, not knowing that the woman smiling politely across from her was experiencing one of the worst days of her life in real time. The Ellen Mariah interview didn't become disturbing in 2008. It became disturbing in 2020, when we all went back and watched it with the information we didn't have before, and we realized that the niceness we'd been sold for 19 years had maybe been covering for something else the entire time. This one is different from the others. It's different because nobody is being pushed, nobody is being humiliated, nobody is dying the next day. The disturbing part of this interview is that the woman being interviewed, with a completely straight face, with the casual effect of someone describing what she had for lunch last Tuesday, tells a story about eating human flesh, and then, having finished the story, moves on to the next topic as though she had just mentioned the weather. María Félix, for anyone unfamiliar, was one of the most important figures in Mexican cinema during the so-called golden age of the 1940s and 50s. Not just an actress, an icon, a force. A woman whose presence was so overwhelming that she generated her own gravitational field everywhere she went. The kind of star who made every other star in the room feel smaller by simply existing nearby. She was nicknamed La Doña because Miss Félix didn't capture the magnitude. She married 4 times. She never apologized for anything. She refused to go to Hollywood because she thought Hollywood should come to her. She starred in nearly 50 films across Mexico, France, Spain, Italy, and Argentina. And by the time she died in 2002 at the age of 88, she had become something closer to mythology than biography. But here's where it gets interesting. For decades, rumors had followed María Félix around like a shadow she couldn't shake. Rumors that she was involved in the occult. Rumors that her home was decorated with demonic artwork. Rumors that her astonishing beauty and her seemingly supernatural career trajectory were not entirely the result of talent and ambition, that something else might have been involved, that someone had made a deal with someone. These rumors were, almost certainly, the product of misogyny and gossip, and the simple fact that a woman who refused to conform to any of the expectations placed on her in 1940s, Mexico was going to generate conspiracy theories the way a magnet generates iron filings. But the rumors existed, and they were persistent, and they were the background noise of her entire career. In 1996, Mexican journalist Ricardo Rocha interviewed her for a program called La Tocada. It would be one of the last major interviews of her life, and during the course of the conversation, which was wide-ranging and touched on her career and her views on women in Mexican society, and her general philosophy of life, she told a story that absolutely nobody in the room was expecting. She explained that in 1951, she had been in Morocco filming a movie called La Corona Negra, a detective film directed in part by Jean Cocteau, and while on location in the city of Chefchaouen, the local sheikh had invited her and Cocteau and other members of the crew to a banquet. This is already a story that sounds like it belongs in a completely different era, the kind of anecdote where you picture a woman in an evening gown sitting cross-legged in a tent in the 1950s, being served dishes she's never seen before by men she's never met. But Félix continued. She said she tried the food. She said she liked it. She said she didn't know what it was. And then, after she'd finished eating, she asked what it was, and she was told it was human meat.
Y nos dio a comer. A mí me gustó. Me gustó, era una cosa como dulzona, una carne extraña. Y pregunté, y así me dijeron, carne humana.
Me volví antropófaga, pero no voluntariamente, she said. I became an anthropophagist, but not voluntarily.
No, pero no voluntariamente. Antropófaga, no voluntariamente.
And here's the thing. It's not the story. The story, as told, is horrible, but it's also tragic in a way that could theoretically generate sympathy. Oh, the poor woman. She didn't know what she was eating. It was the shake's fault, etc. It's how she tells it that makes your spine go cold. She tells it the way you'd tell a story about trying an unusual cheese at a dinner party. She's not horrified. She's not disturbed. She's not even mildly uncomfortable. She's describing the experience with the clinical detachment of a food critic reviewing a restaurant that served her something she didn't expect. And the interviewer, Ricardo Rocha, who by this point in his career had interviewed presidents and criminals and cultural figures across every spectrum, is visibly thrown off. You can see him trying to figure out what to ask next, because nothing in the interviewer's playbook covers the appropriate follow-up question to "I ate human flesh by accident, and I kind of enjoyed it." And here's where the story mixes with the earlier rumors and becomes something much darker than a weird anecdote. Other Mexican actresses had previously claimed, quietly, off the record, that María Félix had sometimes offered them meat at dinners and refused to tell them what it was. There were whispers, always whispers, that consuming human flesh could preserve youth, and María Félix was famously, almost impossibly well preserved into her old age. And when she died in 2002 and her body was eventually exhumed, there were reports which may or may not be reliable but which exist in the historical record and contribute to the mythology, that her body was in a state of preservation that struck observers as unusual. None of this proves anything. All of it is exactly the kind of story that follows a woman who refused to play by the rules for her entire career. But the interview, the 1996 interview with Ricardo Rocha, is real. It exists. You can watch it. And the calm with which she delivers the story is the most disturbing thing in it, because it suggests, if you let it, that maybe the rumors were not entirely rumors, and maybe the Morocco story was not the only time, and maybe the woman sitting across from the interviewer had a secret she was confessing in plain sight, and nobody was equipped to recognize it. María Félix died 6 years later. The interview became her epitaph, and anyone who has ever watched it has come away with the same unanswered question. Was she joking? Alright, this one is a little different from the others on this list because nothing tragic happens. Nobody dies. Nobody gets humiliated. The disturbing part of this interview is that Mel Gibson, sitting across from director Mike Figgis for a 1998 documentary called Hollywood Conversations, tells a story that is either the single weirdest celebrity anecdote ever recorded or evidence that Mel Gibson was, even back in 1998, already starting to come unglued in a way that would eventually manifest in the arrests and the leaked phone calls and the anti-Semitic rants that would get him blacklisted from Hollywood for the better part of a decade. Before we get into the interview, we need to set the scene, because context matters here. Mel Gibson in 1998 was still Mel Gibson. Braveheart had won 5 Oscars 3 years earlier, including Best Director and Best Picture.
And the Oscar for Best Picture is presented to Braveheart.
He was one of the most bankable actors on the planet. He hadn't yet been arrested for DUI in 2006 while making anti-Semitic comments to the arresting officer. He hadn't yet been captured on leaked audio threatening his then-partner Oksana Grigorieva in 2010. He hadn't yet directed The Passion of the Christ, or spent the better part of a decade being functionally exiled from mainstream Hollywood. In 1998, he was, by all appearances, a successful actor and a respected director, sitting down for a fairly standard documentary about the entertainment industry, the kind of interview that was supposed to generate quotable sound bites about craft and storytelling and the business of making movies. What it generated instead was one of the strangest monologues ever committed to video, and to this day, 20+ years later, people still debate whether Gibson was joking, whether he was being genuine, or whether the answer is somehow both. The story Gibson tells is about Christopher Walken. Yes, that Christopher Walken. The Deer Hunter, Pulp Fiction, more cowbell Christopher Walken. The man who has been making the same face and using the same cadence in every role for 50 years and getting universally praised for it. Gibson and Mike Figgis are discussing, in that casual Hollywood way, actors they find intimidating to work with. And Figgis mentions that the first time he ever did a casting session in America, Walken terrified him. Gibson says, "Me too."
In America, Yeah.
Terrified me.
Me too.
And then, prompted by nothing in particular, Gibson launches into an anecdote that starts normally and then does not stay normal. He says Walken came to see him on a rooftop in New York. This is already a weird sentence. Why a rooftop? Why not an office, a hotel lobby, a restaurant, any of the normal places where Hollywood people meet Hollywood people? Gibson doesn't explain. He just says it was a rooftop, and you're supposed to accept this and keep listening. He describes Walken arriving, and this is where the description starts to slide sideways, because according to Gibson, Walken did not walk across the rooftop.
No, he came to see me on a rooftop in New York. I said, hey, can I talk to you? And he said, sure.
He floated in sideways through a crowd of people. He was wearing black. He moved, Gibson says, like one of those old vampire movies where they don't walk, they glide.
And it was like one of those old vampire movies where they don't walk, but they glide.
Gibson then notes, somewhat defensively, that Walken was a dancer and was therefore very graceful, as if this is the normal explanation for why a man would appear to be floating rather than walking at a professional meeting.
And he was a dancer, you know, so he has he's very, you know, graceful.
Yeah.
So they sit down. And Gibson, for reasons that are not explained, and which no rational actor at a first meeting with another actor would ever choose, decides that the appropriate conversation topic is medieval torture devices.
And he began to talk tortures.
He says he'd been reading a book on medieval torture and wanted to talk about it.
Because I'd read this book on torture, and he was like, oh, and he'd try and top it.
Walken apparently was thrilled. The two actors, one of whom would later direct Passion of the Christ and Apocalypto, two films famous for their graphic torture sequences, the other of whom is Christopher Walken, spends some unspecified period of time on a rooftop in New York City, trying to outgross each other with historical atrocities. Gibson would describe an increasingly horrific form of medieval cruelty, and Walken would respond with, oh, according to Gibson's own account, and then try to top him. And this is where, according to Gibson, things got genuinely strange. His personal assistant was also on the rooftop, apparently. Gibson says the assistant left because he couldn't stand it anymore, which is a pretty remarkable thing for an assistant to do, to abandon his boss at a professional meeting because the conversation topic was too disturbing. Gibson then says, and this is a direct quote, the air had turned cold. Not metaphorically cold, physically cold.
He couldn't stand it anymore.
Yeah.
The air had turned cold.
The temperature in his telling dropped. He looked around the rooftop, which by now had become the setting of a slow-building horror movie, and he noticed that they were on top of the Peninsula Hotel in New York. And when he turned his head to avoid Walken's steady gaze, he saw a building across the street, and on top of that building there was a 666, the number 666, illuminated in red, the top halves of 3 sixes from an advertisement or a sign, creating in the specific angle and light of that specific moment the number of the beast from the Book of Revelation, glowing in red against the New York skyline.
I turned around to avoid his steady gaze at one point,
Yeah.
and I was looking at a building with the top of the sixes on it, so there was a huge illuminated 666 in red.
Gibson turned back to look at Walken, and Walken, according to Gibson, was smiling at him. I thought, Gibson says in the interview, visibly laughing but also not entirely laughing, oh no, Chris Walken is the Antichrist.
And I went from that to that to that, and he started smiling. And I thought, oh no, Chris Walken is the Antichrist.
Now, I need to be clear about something. This entire story is probably a joke. Probably. Gibson was almost certainly exaggerating for effect, building up a funny anecdote about an actor famous for being intense and weird, and landing it with a punchline that got laughs from Mike Figgis, and has been getting laughs from audiences for 20 plus years. The 666 sign was almost certainly part of a legitimate advertisement. The floating was almost certainly Walken's well-documented dancer's gate. The cold air was almost certainly just New York. But here's why this interview belongs on this list. And it's not because of what Gibson is saying, it's because of how he's saying it. There is a specific quality to his delivery, a combination of laughter and total conviction, that makes you watch the clip and genuinely not know whether he's kidding. His eyes are bright, he's smiling, but he's also telling this story with the focused intensity of a man who, at some level, actually believes what he's describing, or at least believed it in the moment it was happening, or at least wants you to believe that he believed it. And when you watch this clip in 2024 or 2025 or 2026, knowing everything we now know about Mel Gibson, about his arrests and his rants and the phone calls, and the slow public unraveling of a man who used to be one of the biggest movie stars on the planet, the interview reads differently than it did in 1998. Back then it was a funny celebrity story. Now it's the earliest visible crack in something that would eventually break wide open. People who are fundamentally stable don't generally describe the weather on a rooftop in apocalyptic terms, even as a joke. People who are not, at some level, already fighting something inside their own head don't generally build to a punchline where a fellow actor is literally Satan. And the theories that have grown up around this clip in the years since, the theories that Gibson was exposing something about Hollywood, that he was trying to tell us something, that he was being pushed out because he spoke too freely, those theories exist because the clip itself is so strange that people need a framework to contain it. The interview is 4 minutes long, it's on YouTube, you can watch it right now. And when you do, you'll understand why. Of all the things Mel Gibson has said in public over his long and increasingly chaotic career, this is the one that people keep coming back to, because it's the one where, if you look closely enough, you can see something starting to move behind his eyes that should probably not have been there at all. On the morning of May 7th, 1999, a 34-year-old former child star named Dana Plato walked into the New York studios of The Howard Stern Show to give what she hoped would be a career-saving interview. She had been one of the most famous teenagers in America during the 1980s, playing Kimberly Drummond on Different Strokes for 8 seasons, alongside Gary Coleman and Todd Bridges. She had been on magazine covers, she had been a household name, and then, after the show ended and she aged out of the Hollywood-approved child star demographic, her life had fallen apart in slow, painful, publicly documented stages. She had struggled with substance abuse. She had been arrested in 1991 for robbing a video store in Las Vegas with a pellet gun. She had been arrested again shortly afterward for forging prescriptions for Valium. She had posed for Playboy. She had been working at a dry cleaner's. She had lost custody of her son. She had filed for bankruptcy. By 1999, she was living in an RV park in Florida with her fiancé, Robert Menchaca, and she was trying one more time to put her life back together. She had been sober for 10 years, she said. She wanted to work again. She wanted her career back. And going on the Howard Stern Show, which at the time was the most listened to radio program in America, was supposed to be her opportunity to tell her side of the story, to explain her sobriety, to reintroduce herself to a public that had mostly forgotten her. What happened instead was 30 minutes of the most publicly broadcast cruelty ever aired on American radio.
Dana Plato appeared on the show Different Strokes.
Came into our living rooms every week as a little girl. We watched her grow up.
I'm not exaggerating for effect here. This interview is widely cited, even by radio historians who otherwise admire Stern's work, as one of the darkest segments in the history of the medium. You can listen to it. It's archived. And you can hear in real time a woman who came into that studio hoping for a second chance get methodically dismantled over the course of half an hour by a combination of Stern himself and the callers he kept putting on the air. Plato tries to explain that she's in recovery. Callers tell her she's lying. Plato says she's been sober for 10 years. Callers mock her, call her washed up, tell her she looks old, tell her nobody cares about her anymore, tell her she should do everybody a favor and end it. And Stern, who had the power to cut the calls, to move on, to steer the conversation in any direction he wanted, just doesn't. He lets it happen. He occasionally offers weak, half-hearted defenses of Plato, but he never actually stops the callers, never actually intervenes, never actually treats her like a human being who has come onto his show in a state of obvious fragility. He laughs at certain points. He feeds the callers more ammunition by asking about her arrests, her addiction history, her failed career. The whole thing unfolds like someone slowly taking apart a piece of furniture, piece by piece, while the furniture is still sitting in front of them, asking if they could please stop. At a certain point, desperate to prove she's telling the truth, Plato offers to take a drug test on the air. Right there, immediately. She says she'll submit to anything they want because she's been sober for 10 years and she has nothing to hide.
Been sober for the longest time.
Really?
Oh, it's over a decade now.
No kidding.
No joke.
So you weren't doing any crack or anything with her?
Hell no.
No.
Stern's producer, Gary Delabate, snips a lock of her hair. Plato is visibly shaking. She keeps saying she'll pass. She keeps insisting she's clean. At one point, a caller actually supports her, says something kind about her, and Plato breaks down and starts crying on the air because it's the first piece of kindness she's received in the entire 30-minute ordeal. You can hear it.
No, thank you very, very, very much.
She's really crying.
The sob is in the recording. A woman crying because one stranger out of hundreds was nice to her for 10 seconds. And here's the part that makes this interview unbearable in retrospect. The part where uncomfortable to listen to crosses over into, this should not exist as a public document. Dana Plato left that studio, got in a car with her fiancé, and drove to his mother's house in Moore, Oklahoma, for a Mother's Day visit. On the afternoon of May 8th, 1999, less than 24 hours after the Stern interview ended, Dana Plato was found dead in an RV parked outside the house. She had taken a fatal combination of the painkiller Lortab and the muscle relaxant Soma. The medical examiner initially ruled it an accidental overdose. A later determination, taking into account the amount of medication in her system, her history of depression, and her long history of suicidal behavior, reclassified her death as a suicide. She was 34 years old, the day after she appeared on Howard Stern's show. Trying to explain that she was going to be okay, she was gone. Stern's reaction after her death is the part that elevates this from tragic to genuinely dark. He went on his show the next day and did not apologize. Instead, he suggested that Plato had been lying about her sobriety all along, offering, as evidence, a story about how she had allegedly tried to grab her hair back from his producer after the show ended. "That's when I knew she was lying," he said. "That's when I knew she must have been on drugs." He also reportedly said, "Maybe we gave her her last good time," which is a sentence I would really like to believe he didn't actually say, but which is part of the public record of his response to her death. Betty Bridges, the mother of Plato's former co-star Todd Bridges, publicly blamed Stern for pushing her over the edge. Listeners called in to his own show to blame him. And the clip, the original 30 minutes of the interview, became, over the following years, something that radio historians and cultural critics would point to as the moment when shock jock radio revealed exactly what its business model was actually built on, which was the public suffering of people who had nowhere else to go. And then, 11 years later, on May 6, 2010, 2 days before the 11th anniversary of his mother's death, Dana Plato's 26-year-old son, Tyler, ended his own life with a self-inflicted shotgun wound. Because trauma, it turns out, doesn't just stay with the person who experienced it, it spreads.
A former child star found dead in Oklahoma took his own life. Police say Dana Plato's son, Tyler Lambert, was found dead in Kellyville. He apparently committed suicide with a gunshot to the head.
The interview is still available. You can find it, you can listen to it, and I'm not going to recommend that you do, because there's nothing in it that's going to make your life better. But I will say this. If you ever wonder why people talk about the cruelty of late 90s media culture as a specific, identifiable thing, a thing that did real damage to real people, a thing that we should have stopped sooner than we did, the Dana Plato interview is one of the clearest pieces of evidence that such a culture existed and that some of its most celebrated figures participated in it enthusiastically. Dana Plato wasn't the first person Howard Stern humiliated on the air. She wasn't the last. But she's the one whose name comes up first, every single time, when people talk about the darkest moment in the history of American radio, because the humiliation happened at 11 a.m. on a Friday, and by Saturday night she was gone, and there is no universe in which those two facts are unrelated. Alright, this one isn't technically a TV interview with the person we're discussing. This one is an interview about him, with someone who loved him, and who was on the phone with him in the final hours before he did something so terrible that it permanently rewrote how an entire industry talked about mental health, substance abuse, and chronic brain trauma. Chris Benoit was, by 2007, one of the most respected professional wrestlers in the world. He'd been WWE World Heavyweight Champion. He was known throughout the industry as a technician, a workhorse, a guy who treated every match like it mattered even when it didn't. The kind of performer other wrestlers looked up to precisely because he never phoned it in. He was Canadian, quiet off camera, devoted to his wife Nancy and their 7-year-old son Daniel. His best friend had been Eddie Guerrero, the legendary wrestler who had died suddenly in 2005 of heart failure, and Benoit had been publicly devastated by the loss, carrying it with him in visible ways that his colleagues noticed but didn't know how to address. Eddie's nephew, Chavo Guerrero Jr., was one of Benoit's closest remaining friends in the business, a younger wrestler who looked up to him like family. On the weekend of June 22, 2007, Chris Benoit was supposed to fly to Texas for a WWE live event. He never showed up. By Monday afternoon, he, his wife, and their son were all dead, in their home in Fayetteville, Georgia, in what would be revealed to be a 2-day double murder followed by a suicide. The WWE was in the middle of a pay-per-view broadcast when the news broke, and they initially dedicated the entire show to Benoit's memory, believing he had been the victim of a tragedy rather than the cause of one. That 3-hour tribute, which aired on live television, would later become one of the most painful pieces of footage in the company's history, because they were eulogizing a man while the reality of what he had done was still being uncovered by police. The tribute was never re-aired. Benoit's name was scrubbed from WWE programming almost overnight. His championships were quietly removed from official histories. It was, and remains, one of the most comprehensive erasures of a single performer in professional wrestling history. But here's where the interview comes in. In 2014, and then more extensively in 2020 for the Vice TV series Dark Side of the Ring, Chavo Guerrero sat down on camera and described, in detail, the phone call he'd had with Chris Benoit in the hours before Chavo knew anything was wrong, because Chavo, like everyone else in Benoit's orbit, had been communicating with a man he believed was just tired and stressed, a man dealing with a sick family and a missed flight, a man making small talk before a weekend of wrestling shows. And what Chavo describes in that interview is genuinely haunting, because you realize, listening to him recount it, that every single detail he'd noticed in the moment had seemed slightly off, and that each of those details was, in retrospect, a signal that he was talking to someone whose life and mind had already completely come apart. The first call came around 3:30 p.m. Eastern Daylight Time on Saturday, June 23rd. Benoit left a voicemail saying he'd missed his flight because of food poisoning in the house, that Nancy and Daniel were sick, that he'd be late for the show in Beaumont.
Daniel and Nancy have food poisoning, and I'm just trying to take care of them. And I'm like, oh man, are you good? You right?
Chavo called back. Benoit picked up. And here's the first detail Chavo remembers. Benoit sounded tired, groggy, off. Not in an alarming way, not in a way that made Chavo think something was wrong, but enough that Chavo, who knew him well, noticed it and called him back 12 minutes later just to check in. They had a brief conversation. Chavo asked if he was okay. Benoit said he was. And then, just before they hung up, Benoit said something that Chavo would remember for the rest of his life. He said, "I love you, Chavo."
And he goes, Chavo. Chavo. I go, yeah? And he goes, I love you.
Now, in wrestling, especially within the Guerrero family orbit, "I love you" was something they said to each other all the time. It was normal. It was the kind of thing close friends in that community said when ending a phone call, the same way families do. But this time, Chavo said, it sounded different. It sounded forced. It sounded heavier. Chavo said, in the Dark Side of the Ring interview, that he remembers pausing.
Yeah, I'm okay.
Feeling that something was off about the tone, the weight, the way Benoit had pushed the words out. But he couldn't put his finger on what exactly was wrong. He told himself Benoit was just stressed. He said, "Love you too, man." And they hung up.
I'm like, okay, brother, I love you too, man.
What Chavo didn't know at that moment was that Nancy Benoit had been dead for hours. She had been killed, according to the medical examiner, on the night of June 22nd, which was the night before Chavo ever received that first voicemail. Daniel would be killed the following morning, sedated in his bed by his own father. By the time Chavo and Benoit had their "I love you" conversation on Saturday afternoon, Chris Benoit was a man whose wife and child were already gone, whose life was already over in every way that mattered. And he was making a phone call to his best friend about a missed flight and food poisoning because he didn't know what else to do. And he told Chavo he loved him because it was the last time he was going to be able to. And then came the text messages. At 3:53 a.m. on Sunday, June 24th, Chavo woke up to his phone buzzing. The first text was from Chris Benoit's cell phone. It said simply, "My physical address is 130 Green Meadow Lane, Fayetteville, Georgia 30215. Chavo, half asleep, looked at it, confused. 2 minutes later, a second text arrived from the same phone. "The dogs are in the enclosed pool area and the back door is open."
The dogs are in the enclosed pool area and the back door is open.
30 seconds after that, Chavo's phone buzzed again, and this time the text was from Nancy Benoit's phone, sending the exact same messages. Then another, then another. 5 text messages in total, sent from 2 different phones in the Benoit household, in the middle of the night, saying nothing but the address and details about the dogs and the back door.
From Nancy's phone, and it says the exact same thing.
Chavo, still groggy, assumed they were old messages finally coming through. He told himself Benoit had probably been drinking. He went back to sleep. WWE referee Scott Armstrong, who was also close to Benoit, received the same texts and came to the same conclusion. Neither of them could have known that what they were reading was a set of instructions. Benoit, in his final hours, was leaving a trail of breadcrumbs so that someone, anyone, would know where to find his family's bodies. He was telling them how to get in, what to do with the dogs, where the house was. It was the last coherent thing he did before hanging himself in his home gym using a weight machine. When Chavo told the story on Dark Side of the Ring, he did not hold back his emotion. He talks about the "I love you" and his voice catches. He talks about the text messages, and you can see him struggling with the weight of what he now understands was happening while he was sleeping. And the interview has become, for wrestling fans, and for people who study true crime, one of the most chilling first-hand accounts of a murder-suicide in the modern era, because Chavo is describing not the crime itself, but the agonizing quietness that surrounded it, the phone calls and the texts and the small moments when he sensed something was wrong and dismissed it, and the terrible realization, years later, of what those moments had actually meant. Benoit's death triggered one of the most important conversations in the history of professional wrestling and contact sports in general. His brain was studied by the Sports Legacy Institute after his death, and researchers discovered that it was so damaged by chronic traumatic encephalopathy, the same brain disease that would later be linked to NFL players, that it resembled the brain of an 85-year-old Alzheimer's patient. The theory most commonly accepted today is that CTE, combined with steroid abuse, prescription painkiller dependency, and the unresolved trauma of Eddie Guerrero's death, combined into a psychological breaking point that we still don't fully understand. None of that excuses what he did. Nothing does. But the Chavo Guerrero interview, the one where he walks you through the final phone call and the text messages, and the slow, horrible realization of what he had been hearing without knowing, is the closest any of us will ever get to understanding the last hours of a mind that had already collapsed from the inside. The interview is still on YouTube, it's still on the Vice TV archive, and it remains, for anyone who has seen it, one of the single most disturbing pieces of footage in the history of wrestling. Not because of what's shown, but because of what Chavo is describing from memory, haunted by the things he didn't recognize in the moment and cannot now forget. That's the real horror of these interviews, not the content, the permanence, and the fact that every time someone new discovers one of these clips and watches it for the first time, the discomfort gets transferred, the weight gets passed along, the moment keeps happening, and the only thing any of us can do is try maybe to listen a little more carefully next time someone is sitting across from us trying to tell us something, before the camera turns off and it's too late. Thanks for watching.